In this video, we're going to examine the shader tree. The shader tree in Modo is the part of the user interface that allows the user to create textures, import texture maps, create materials for their objects, create procedurals. It's basically the area that allows the user to influence how their objects are going to be shaded, lit, and how they're going to look upon the final render. Now, I have a pretty cool scene loaded up. I have this great model of an Alfa Romeo, and I've added a very simple environment backdrop on it, and it looks pretty good in the final render. But if I want to control individually how, the colors of the paint or maybe the tires or something, I need to go into the shader tree to adjust all of these properties. Now, to find the shader tree, look at your item list. It's the tab directly to the right. So this tab right here, it's kind of getting cut off because my screen size is so small. But it says shader tree. If we click on it, this is what you're probably going to get. Now, I'm going to collapse some of these options here and kind of boil it down to all of its major parameters. So this is what the shader tree looks like with each individual component collapsed. At the very top of the list, there's always going to be a category called render. This render section, let's open it on up. This render section is the most important part of the shader tree because it directly influences how the final render is going to look. Now, the render section of the shader tree works kind of a little bit different. On the surface, it might look like your layers palette inside of Photoshop, but it works and behaves just a little bit differently. The render section starts to shade and starts to shade our scene starting from the bottom. So this base material, this is the color of the entire scene, actually. If we click on it, we can see down in the properties that at the most fundamental level, every single polygon in our scene is going to be white until it moves up one step. The entire shader tree works from the bottom towards the top. So it's going to evaluate the first thing that it sees at the bottom of the list. It's going to evaluate the properties of this base material. In this case, it's white. And then as soon as the rendering engine is done evaluating this item, it's going to go to the one directly above it and figure out what it says. Now, this Alfa Romeo item has all the material and all the material groups that make up and comprise the look of our car. And as you can see here, there's quite a few material groups, and each one of these material groups is responsible for changing how one part of the car is going to get shaded and rendered. So there's a whole bunch of them here. Let's see if I can find one. Let's see, main body. This is probably the color of the car, and it looks like the color of the car is being driven by a diffuse color. So let's make it blue. There we go. Now our car is blue. Okay, so each one of these material groups is responsible for shading a single set of polygons, and we can control that, and we'll talk about controlling polygons with material selection sets here in a bit. But the shader tree works off of a very fundamental principle, and that is it's going to evaluate all of the items, but it's going to start at the bottom. It's going to look here at the base material, then work its way up. So initially, like I said, everything is white. And then it evaluates the component immediately above the base material, which is the Alfa Romeo item class, and it has all of these material groups in it. So as soon as it's done doing that, it goes to the base shader. Now, the base shader is responsible for adjusting a number of different channels, including the direct illumination, global illumination. Probably the biggest ones that I use all the time is this is where I get to control what kind of shadows are cast, if the objects below the base shader are visible to the camera. Now, the base shader is kind of interesting because if we change anything in the base shader, it's only going to affect the items directly below it. So if I was to say, let's turn off visible to camera. Notice that the car disappears. The shadow remains because the shadow is being controlled by this shadow catcher right here. So the base shader is only going to affect the items directly below it. Okay? So if I check visible to camera back on, it's now turning the visibility of this material group here and the base shader back on. So the base shader looks at everything below it. So the entire shader tree starts from the bottom. As soon as it hits the shader is going to look below it and see what it needs to evaluate. And then as soon as that's done, it's going to go up one. Now the shadow catcher. This shadow catcher is driving all of the ground shadows. So these guys right in here. If we were to turn this off, you can see, there we go. Now our shadows are going to disappear. Okay, let's turn it back on. And there we go. Just takes a second to update. There it is. Now our shadows are back. Okay, so again, it's starting from the bottom and working our way towards the top. Now, when we get to the top of the render section of the shader tree, we can find two render outputs. We have the final color output and the alpha output. These two render outputs are responsible for physically drawing the pixels when we render this image. Okay, so the final color output is going to produce an image, a color image. So basically, what you see right here in the preview window, it's going to produce this image from the final color render output. The alpha output, however, is going to make an alpha channel of all of the polygons in the scene. So we're going to get an alpha channel for the car, for the ground plane. We're not going to get an alpha channel for the photograph in the background because that's a photograph. It's not true three-dimensional geometry. So the alpha render output is going to give you a transparency or alpha channel for our 3D geometry in the scene. Last but not least, I want to show you one additional thing. In the render section of the shader tree, if we click on the little purple sphere, we have some properties down here that I want to draw your attention towards. The most important one, in my opinion, is the frame and settings category. Let's talk about the frame just for 2 seconds. This is where we get to control the size and resolution of our final rendered image. We also have control right here of the frame range. If we're rendering an animation, this is how long our animation is going to be. Here is the height and width, the frame height, frame width. That is the resolution. So right now we will render an image that is 720 by 480 pixels at a DPI of 300 and a pixel aspect ratio of 1.0. So the frame portion of your render settings is really important because we're going to be going into this all the time and adjusting the frame height and the width, the pixel aspect ratio, depending on the desired rendered output. The settings, this is going to help control the quality of your render. If you want your render to be of a higher quality, you're probably going to reduce the refinement threshold and you're going to reduce the refinement shading rate. You can also increase or decrease the quality of your shadows. This is where we turn on depth of field, motion blur. If we wanted to render 3D images, as you would see in like the 3D IMAX movies that are pretty popular right now, we would check on stereoscopic to render 3D true 3D images out of Modo. So the frame and the settings sections are very important. Also, under the render section properties, we have our options for our global illumination. Now, I want to have an entire course on global illumination, but just know that this little property tab right here is where we get to enable global illumination. So this is a good one to have on. And I just turned it on, and now our scene is being lit by the environment map in the background, and you can see our blue Alfa Romeo now looks a little bit more realistic, and it looks like it's inserted into the scene a little bit more accurately because it's being lit by all the colors of this background image. This blue sky, the reflection, the indirect bounces off of the buildings, this tree over here is all influencing how this car is going to get shaded in the final render. Okay, so that's the render section of the shader tree. Let's close this guy because there's a couple other things I want to show you. In Modo, we have the option to add environments. Let's explore this just a little bit. So we have this environment section here, and this little guy right here represents an image map. And this image map is probably going to be the background image of this of our render over here. Every environment also gets a material. This material has a number of colors that we can control. That's also going to affect how the shading of our car is going to look. This particular scene has two different types of environments. You can have multiple types of environments, and each environment can be assigned to shade and render specific portions of that scene. Towards the bottom of this list, underneath the environment sections, we have control on how our lights are going to be affecting our scene, including the transform channel for our lights. So we can change the XYZ, rotation scale, all that jazz. In the light properties down here at the bottom, this is what the radiance excidence. This is where we get to control how bright the lights are in our scene, as well as the shadow types. This light has a couple other properties in it, like the spread angle. But we're going to talk a lot about lights later. But just know that we can adjust all of those properties and parameters from the shader tree as well. Each light is going to get its own material. There it is. And most important about the light material is that we can change the color of our light. Maybe we want our light to be red. And now you can see over here that the The light is casting a red hue over the entire car, which is kind of creepy. Makes it look like it's on Mars or something. Let's put that back to a nice light yellow. There we go. That looks pretty good. All right. Pretty awesome. And then last but not least, in the shader tree, we have access to our camera. And much like the lights, we have full control over its transform, including the position, rotation, and scale. We can also start to adjust some of the more camera-specific items, including the type of lens that our camera has, the focal length, the field of view. If you're used to working in a traditional 35 millimeter film world, you're going to want to go in and adjust the film height and width and the offset and on a lot of that stuff. So you have some really specific controls on your camera down here at the bottom as well. Okay, so that's the shader tree. This is just designed to be a quick overview to introduce you to what it is and how it basically works. The most important part is this purple sphere, the render section at the top of the shader tree, and it works from the bottom up. So that's the shader tree.